It's raining so much. Are you ready for the talk about floods now? Oh, some people are flooding in. Are you ready? Are you ready for this? Welcome, everyone. I'm Michi Kamigaki-Baron, and this is the Resident Member Series. I want to begin by acknowledging that we're in Musqueam land. Let's just remember this during all engagements at UBC. For those of you who are new, and I see that there are many new faces, this is a Resident Member Series. And the Resident Member Series is a public event at Green College where resident members, mostly graduate students, share their research or a related topic in their field. Today, I'm very excited to welcome Charlotte Milne. Charlotte is a PhD student in the Institute for Resources, Environment, and Sustainability, supervised by Professor Stephanie Chang. A physical geographer and earth scientist by training, Charlotte specialized in fluvial.
No, you got it.
Fluvial. I'm so sorry. Fluvial geomorphology, which means the study of rivers and their behavior, before shifting into the field of disaster science during her 3 years as a professional researcher. Charlotte now investigates riverine flood risk management and how we improve flood mapping practice and management, in particular how mapping and modeling methods can be indigenized to help reduce the risk of Canada's First Nations communities who are disproportionately exposed to flooding. So today, Charlotte will be presenting her talk entitled, "There's No Such Thing as a Natural Disaster, How We Made Floods the Most Damaging Hazard in the World." I can hear lots of people wrestling in their seats, so let's not wait any longer. Please join me in welcoming Charlotte.
Thank you, everyone. Hello, my name is Charlotte. I don't need to do an introduction to the talk because that was absolutely amazing, but thank you all for coming. And what a day to talk about flooding. Perfect. Before we get going, a little bit about me. Ko te awa, ko Motangi te awa. I'm the river's me, and my ancestors' river is Motangi, near the top of the North Island of Aotearoa of New Zealand. And before we get going, I think it's really important to kind of ground ourselves in the topic a little bit. So everyone in the room, maybe you can think of a river that is close to you, whether that's one you grew up in or like one that, the Fraser River here in Vancouver, and you can think of kind of what makes it a beautiful natural river that probably does flood. And then maybe also you can think of a flood that you might have witnessed or has impacted you, and you can kind of think of, the destruction that also does come along with flooding. A real brief bit about my background before we get going, just so people know. I'm an earth scientist and a physical geographer. My master's is in fluvial geomorphology and specifically a lot of GIS and 3D modelling, drone photogrammetry. I looked at the impact of the 2016 Kaikoura earthquake on the rivers down there and how that changed their flood risk. And in the years that followed, I was a professional researcher for a few years, mostly on social science projects and actually working on a lot of Indigenous-led projects back home in Aotearoa. Since coming to UBC, I'm a PhD student, and that's great. I'm also a research assistant with the Living with Water project, which is a project run by the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, a bunch of different universities, and also Squamish First Nation. And I'm also a graduate research fellow with the Disaster Resilience Research Network here at UBC, and we're doing a big review of the current disaster resilience situation in BC currently. So let's get started. And for some of us, this might be pretty common information, but for a lot of people, I actually don't think we talk about disasters that much. So we're going to start with the basics, then lead into flooding, and then talk really briefly about my research. So what makes a disaster? I want you all to picture what you think of as a natural disaster in your mind right now. And maybe that's like raging wildfires, or maybe you think of a volcano, or maybe a tsunami, or maybe you're from a tropical place like I am and you think of a hurricane. But in reality, any of those events that I just listed are just that. They're natural events. If a flood happens in a lake that no one even knows about, is that a disaster? Is that even a hazard, or is that just a natural, essential process? The term natural disaster itself is kind of a fallacy, right? When you have insurance and it says things like discounting natural events or acts of God, what does that even mean? Because excluding you going and climbing into an active volcano, normally when we experience disasters, it's in our homes, it's in our own transport networks, it's in places that we're led to believe are safe. So is it the event's fault that the disaster happens, or is it failure in the protective measures that society has built up? To really understand disasters, you first kind of have to understand risk, and risk has three main components. Firstly, there's the hazard, and that can be defined as any natural process that directly threatens the human environment. The event itself is not a hazard. A process or event becomes a hazard once it impacts humans or their properties, or kind of what I look at, their cultural connections and values. So when the Fraser River floods, obviously it impacts a lot of people, therefore it's a hazard. Exposure is then the situation where people and infrastructure, housing, all those tangible human assets are located in hazard-prone areas. And so we're all exposed here in Vancouver to a Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. Downtown's exposed to coastal flooding. We're also exposed to, longer onset hazards, maybe extreme heat or, wildfire smoke exposure. And then when you think about exposure, you should also think about who is most likely to be hit by a hazard, who will have access to help, to those emergency response measures. And that's when you have to talk about vulnerability and coping capacity. Vulnerability can be defined as the conditions determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors which increase the susceptibility of a community to the impact of hazards. And we've all kind of seen this, right? When Hurricane Katrina hit, it was disproportionately the black and poor communities who were impacted. Here in Canada, researchers have proven that First Nations are disproportionately exposed to flooding. So not all communities are equally vulnerable. So when you put those three factors together, hey, you get risk. How at risk are we? What is our acceptable level of risk? We all choose to live in Vancouver despite being quite overdue for a catastrophic earthquake, right? Because we perceive the risk level to be acceptable. But would you build your house beneath a crumbling cliff? Hopefully not, and also hopefully your government would have some kind of measures to stop you doing that. So when your risk is high and a hazard comes along and your houses are exposed and you've got vulnerable populations, that's when you get a disaster. And the World Health Organization defines a disaster as an occurrence disrupting the normal conditions of existence and causing a level of suffering that exceeds the capacity of adjustment of the affected community. So how can we kind of manage our risk? And there's typically four main ways we can do that. We can mitigate risk, and that's also sometimes called reduction. Essentially, you're trying to stop a hazard having as much impact. And usually that starts with risk identification, so understanding the hazards that we're exposed to and mapping them. Mitigation also includes efforts to minimize those hazards. So maybe you want to try and stop a landslide happening at all. You might build a rock cage over that slope. Or maybe you want to do it in a more natural way, so you do things like planting to stabilize the slope. Mitigation can also include, building resilient infrastructure in buildings. So thinking of all the earthquake proofing that's happening down at Moa down the road. And mitigation also includes your policies that prevent exposure in the first place. Your land use planning, your building codes, and that becomes really tricky in a lot of cities because we usually built cities before we really understood risk. But policies can also include new things to try and decrease that, so you'll manage retreat if cities have that capacity, which a lot don't. Once you've done everything you can to try and kind of stop a hazard having impact, you should still assume it's going to happen, and that's the next step where you've got your preparedness. This step includes top-down, citywide emergency planning, all the way down to the individual level. So, your personal evacuation plans and education. So like when was the last time we all did a drop, stop, cover, hold earthquake drill, for instance? It's also at the stage where you have your adaptive social protection measures. So in a city like Vancouver, with a large houseless community and also a large immigrant community, many of whom might not speak English, it's really important that we prepare how we're going to help those communities if a disaster does happen. So a disaster does happen anyway. The next step is response, and this step is often where all that short-term relief has to fill in the holes that were created during the first two steps. And it includes, all the things you would expect, like evacuation and emergency shelter, and it also includes often large amounts of money from emergency funds, and you have to get a lot of help from elsewhere. Finally, we have recovery. And ideally, what we do here is we take all the valuable lessons that we learnt through the mitigation and preparedness stages, and we build back better. Because if we simply build back the same, what's to stop the exact same disaster happening again? And actually, even more likely, what's to stop an even worse disaster happening under climate change forcing? Unfortunately, usually what happens is that funds are only available to build back to the exact same level. And even if some funds are available to build back slightly better, it's usually only enough to do something small, like maybe build your dikes a little bit higher. It's not enough to really change the whole system. Altogether, these 4 steps make up the disaster risk reduction process. And we frequently see a lot of focus here adhere, so on hard mitigation measures, trying to control the hazards themselves, and then also on expensive response measures. And that's really termed reactive disaster management. You try to stop the hazard, it's going to happen anyway, and then all of a sudden you have a big bill to pick up. But there is kind of a better way. The field of disaster management has, over the last 5 years or so, really shifted towards thinking about disaster resilience instead. Resilience can be defined as the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. So you don't actually hear any mention there of trying to stop the hazard itself. Instead, it's more about how we absorb those impacts. Here you'd see all that spending, or most of it, shift away from the hazards and instead towards reducing those exposures and those vulnerabilities. Time and time again, we've witnessed that engineered prevention of hazards, it doesn't really work in the long term. Instead, if we can live alongside hazard and minimise their impact for everyone, we'd all have less risk. This becomes especially important under climate change, where we see both environmental hazards increasing in both their frequency and intensity. So you've got your storms and your sea level rise causing more flooding. You've got your more extreme heat and lightning strikes causing more wildfires. And then you've also got things like melting glaciers and permafrost potentially causing new seismic and volcanic activity. You've also got things like more concurrent hazards, so longer spring hot periods cause more flooding, and that now goes alongside periods of wildfire, so it's more money that we have to spend because there's concurrent hazards. There's also cascading hazards where, wildfires cause lots of trees to die, and therefore you get more landslides. Essentially, climate change is going to make things a lot worse, and we don't actually know how much worse. Therefore, we're far better off preparing for that worst case scenario and living alongside these events, rather than trying to build our walls high and watching them come down. Ideal resilience management would see all those principles of disaster risk reduction combined with climate change adaptation principles. So, understanding that changing climate is completely linked to how we're going to manage disaster risk. But in reality, most scenarios we are very far away from resilience-focused management style. Canada is still pretty situated in that disaster management focus, trying to keep those hard controls on the hazards. And the downsides of this approach is mostly what we're going to talk about today, specifically in the context of flooding. So, floods are the most destructive hazard in the world, both from loss of life and monetary damage. And these damages have been on an upwards trajectory globally. Here are some images from places that are flooded in 2023 alone, from all over the world, and we're not sure of the death toll yet this year, but it's well into the thousands. There are many different types of floods, but coastal floods, fluvial or riverine floods, and pluvial floods are the main ones. And pluvial floods, if you didn't know, are the collection of water on impermeable surfaces or saturated ground. So probably you walked past a bunch of pluvial flooding on your way in today. Today we're really going to focus on riverine flooding, because that's what I study. Typically in the sciences and engineering, floods are defined hydraulically by their water level or their peak discharge, so how much water flows through a given point at a given time. But this does little to tell us about the damage that's actually experienced. Often we seek to measure damage and destruction of floods by estimating their monetary loss or their loss of life. For instance, the 2021 BC floods are now estimated to have resulted in more than 12 billion Canadian dollars, making them one of the most expensive floods in the world ever. While an example of loss of life is the China floods of 1931, which killed somewhere, it's estimated, between 3 and 4 million people. There are also many aspects of flood damage that are really hard to capture. The psychological and cultural tolls that they can take, for instance, the trauma associated with loss of life and destruction of homes, it can be kind of expected, but it's also more than that. Even with minor flooding, there can be impacts. There's been psychologists in New Zealand following our 2023 floods that have looked at the fact that a lot of people actually have PTSD symptoms when they hear the sound of rain. So, riverine floods are scary and they can destroy lives and economies, but it is actually really important that we still let rivers flood. And I could talk all day about this topic, but I'm going to limit myself to just 4 benefits of flooding. Firstly, there's your ecological benefits. Flooding for many species is the only way to create suitable habitat. Many species of flora and fauna rely actively on functioning floodplains for their food and shelter. Many species of fish rely on heterogeneous surfaces for their reproductive cycles. You can see this example here from Severity et al. Of flood reworking, the geomorphic work that's put in during a flood, all those movings of sediment, and the vegetation that grows after because of that active working. Secondly, there's agricultural benefits, right? It's no surprise that most of the world's fertile land is situated upon current or relic floodplains. The alluvium, so that's the fine sediment that rivers deposit during floods, is ideal for soil and for crop growth. These soils usually only remain fertile for so long, so it's important that we have those replenishing flood activities. And furthermore, that we have crops that are resilient to periods of saturation. And a really great example of that is seen in the Yolo bypass in California, where they have seasonal flooding and they allow it to do so. There's water benefits. When floods occur in a natural way, waters pass through the floodplain and the water is filtered, so it makes it cleaner to drink from, to swim in, to fish in. And also, if you allow flooding to occur in natural ways, it's more effective at replenishing groundwater. So essentially, if you allow floods to happen, we're more safeguarded from droughts. Finally, natural flooding can protect us from disastrous flooding. If rivers are allowed space to flood, then the natural floodplains can act as stores of water. They also slow down the river and the floodwaters, so they do less damage. If rivers frequently flood, they also build up their own natural levees, their own kind of natural dikes, which can act as a secondary buffer to prevent too far a spread of water. Finally, if we understand the flooding behaviour of rivers because they're allowed to flood, we can also better mitigate and prepare for all of those things. If you stop a river flooding, if you strip away its life, you create what's often termed a zombie river. And an example of this can be seen here in this river from the South Island of New Zealand. You can see it in 1940, all the way over there, right across the river channel, and in 2020, how much it's been confined. Sure, water is still flowing down that river, and sure, it's kind of safely within its new channels, but there is so much less life there. So, floods are life-giving. Why have they transformed into something so destructive? Yes, climate change is really important. You know, with increasing rainfall, we're getting increasing flooding, also increasing snowmelt with higher temperatures. Also in Canada, you can kind of even get the opposite, where unusually cold periods cause unusual freezing of rivers and increasing ice jam floods. But climate change has been happening for a while, and the damage that we see increasing is far more rapid than climate change alone. The real reason we're seeing such increasing amounts of damage is kind of our own insistence to make ourselves vulnerable. It's long been thought that we could control rivers, building dikes and dams and other hard structures to keep water exactly where we wanted it. And for a long time that did work. But if you build a dike, what you do is you create a new area of seemingly safe land that people can build on. And that's a piece of land that would have otherwise remained safe. Here's an example in BC of a river that has been diked, and look at how close those buildings are to that river. Once people and their livelihoods are settled on that land, you kind of had no other option than maintaining that dike. When the risks of building in an old floodplain are understood, often the land in those areas also becomes cheaper, and that's where you see a high concentration of marginalised or poor communities. And often it's these communities who can't necessarily afford to handle the damages associated with flooding. We also sometimes see a phenomenon where you get the opposite, and you get really high value industry. So think your boutique shopping malls and your expensive water view condos that choose to build alongside rivers for their wellness benefits. And when those flood, you see a huge skyrocket in the monetary damage that happens. And because those industries and people can often afford public flood insurance, it's typically taxpayers that have to pick up the bill for those repairs. But there are other ways to reduce risk, right? Increasing personal flood awareness, risk perception, or willingness to pay for insurance. Unfortunately, even those can get a little complicated. There's examples in the US of real estate markets actively deceiving home buyers from understanding their flood risk. And in Canada, we actually have such limited flood mapping, we don't really know where is at risk, so we can't necessarily tell people to be aware of that. What we have seen in BC is examples of tsunami warning signs being removed due to fears of them impacting house prices. So it's pretty safe to assume that similar things happen with flood risk awareness. Insurance should also help protect us all, but most private insurance companies in Canada simply refuse to insure for flood damage. And despite it being recently announced, we still don't have a federal flood insurance program. Even once we get one, it doesn't necessarily mean everything will be okay. In the US, they've had one for decades, run through the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And what they do is they create flood risk maps, and then if people fall inside the risk zones, they have to pay for flood insurance. But what happens is wealthy cities can push back on that and delay the insurance process for years under the guise of trying to keep residents' taxes low. And then what happens is they'll change the map so less people are in the risk zones, and then those people still get flooded because just because you change the map doesn't mean those people aren't at risk, and then they're just simply not insured and their lives are destroyed. An example of the combination of a lot of these factors can be seen here in BC, where we continue to allow development in many floodplains. In Canada, there used to be the Federal Flood Damage Reduction Program, which saw provinces in the 70s and 80s and 90s signing on with the federal government to try and get better flood management happening. And part of that was to undertake flood mapping and to not allow development in floodplains, essentially. And if development did happen, those developments wouldn't be eligible for federal help if a flood happened. Makes sense, right? But that agreement only lasted until the 90s, and then flood management devolved to the municipal level in 2004. And then many municipalities simply folded under real estate and industry pressure to allow rebuilding on floodplains. And that's why you get things like hospitals in the floodplain in the city of Richmond. Now to worsen the situation, there's more than 100 dikes in BC that are considered orphaned. That is, the province built them in the 60s or 80s, and then when the management shifted to the municipal level, they didn't want to pick up the bill, so they're just not maintained. It's estimated now that if the Fraser River was to flood to its known extreme, the 1894 big flood that it had, more than half of these dikes would be overtopped, even if they don't fail, which they probably would. And the estimated damage is somewhere over 20 billion Canadian dollars. So, damage is in a large way a product of historic flood management decision-making that was initially intended to help protect us. But unfortunately for some communities, flood management was never designed to help them in the first place, and instead it destroyed their lives. Globally, we see flooding disproportionately impact Indigenous communities. Researchers have found that in Canada, 81% of First Nation reserves are at risk of flooding. These same nations would have once probably lived in harmony with the rivers in flooding, so moving in and out seasonally, and very unlikely in most cases not building permanent structures in the floodplains. Of course, this all changed during the forced relocation of First Nation communities in Canada when First Nations were forced onto reserves. It was often the swampy, small floodplain patches that were favoured as reserved by the settler governments. And once nations were trapped on these lands, their flood risk was pretty much sealed. And it's not just this forced exposure that has caused disproportionate flood risk for many communities, it's also colonial flood engineering that's had terrible impact for many. The 2021 floods in BC became famous when Seamuth Lake returned. I'm sure many of you know all about it. The lake was drained in the 1920s by settler farmers seeking better agricultural land, but also looking to decrease their flood risk. For 100 years, the lake was kept at bay by artificial pump systems, and a huge, expensive agricultural and industrial area was built up. And then when it flooded from the Nooksack River in 2021, the lake came back and it caused a lot of destruction. For the local Seamuth community and other Stolo nations, the removal of their lake under the guise of flood protection was world-changing. They lost their main food source, a place of spiritual connection, than traditional hunting and fishing practices. Flood management essentially caused the destruction of their traditional way of life. And this quote from Chief Dalton Silver really summed it up. Our people at the time couldn't comprehend why someone would want to drain a lake and change or alter Mother Nature in such a way. That would be a disaster. And you'd hope that a lot of this would be learnt post-2021, but the pump station is being rebuilt as part of a $3 billion flood management plan with the City of Abbotsford and others, and it's almost entirely focused on hard engineering options. Another example is in Manitoba, where they've also had a lot of contentious flood management issues. Not only were nations there forced onto floodplain reserves, the flood management decisions made by provincial government actively saw them placed at greater risk. Floodwaters were designed to be taken away from main cities like Winnipeg and instead into the lakes within the Lake St. Martin and Little Saskatchewan First Nation territories. And in 2011, a major flood saw these communities displaced, with numbers in the thousands who weren't able to return home for years. Following this atrocity, there was many discussions about how best to help these communities, and there was a lot of talk about relocation away from their traditional territories. But of course, with a history of settler relocation of these nations, obviously that wasn't a very popular option for them. In 2022, those who lived in the area settled with the government for $85 million, but in those 10 years it took for that to happen, members of the local nations saw increased rates of violence, mental health issues, poverty, food insecurity, again, all in the name of flood management. Both of the case studies I've outlined here show the importance of allowing, one, freshwater systems to behave in a natural manner, but two, the government's inequitable treatment of First Nations in flood management decision-making. In order for there to be just and fair flood management decisions, Indigenous people need to be involved in all aspects of flood management, and including the very first steps, flood mapping itself. So that leads on to my research. My research is driven by much of what was talked about today, but specifically the 2 points are that flood risk in Canada is pretty unknown, and the unjust colonial flood management practices that don't really serve many of Canada's Indigenous First Nations. I specifically take an interdisciplinary look at flood mapping. So flood mapping is the first step to any kind of flood management decision making, pretty much, where you're going to build your dike, land use planning, where you want to help your river recover. It all stems from flood mapping. We have to understand where the river might and has previously flooded and the potential risk of damage in those areas. But flood mapping is hard. It often comes with high amounts of uncertainty, and this increases under climate change. So we need to think about new ways of best doing mapping. Furthermore, if flood mapping is only designed through a Western lens, that is one that is focused on monetary loss as a singular measure of risk, then those maps will never serve communities who have differing worldviews. And we may see continued destruction of areas that have cultural or spiritual significance, for instance, both due to a lack of flood protection in those areas or due to flood protection that's simply inappropriate and causes degradation of the landscape. We need to figure out ways to involve Indigenous communities at the mapping stage so that their values and interests can be represented throughout later flood management decision making. Mapping tends to really be left solely to specialist engineers or GIS technicians, while the sort of social implications or deeper importance of maps isn't really thought about. That's always thought about at the later stages, at the end stages of management. And there's many different kinds of maps and many different kinds of ways of making them, and it's this whole technical thing that I'm not going to talk about today because it's kind of boring. But the main important things are that flood mapping in Canada is sparse, it's often hugely out of date, and it varies drastically between provinces with very little communication. My research has three main components. Firstly, I'm doing an analysis of the current state of Canada's flood mapping for the purposes of flood management decision making, which isn't something that's really been done before in the literature in Canada. So we really need to know what's out there in order to make recommendations on how to improve it. And you can see some examples of BC flood maps here. That's a recent one from 2021 of the Lower Fraser River, which is pretty great, but it's a very rare example of a good BC flood map. Most of them are like this from the 1980s and completely don't represent current land cover or river behaviour. Secondly, in partnership with Seamuth First Nation and supported by the Public Scholars Initiative here at UBC and also some other research partners, we hope to undertake flood risk mapping for the nation's territory, including their own perspectives and values. And this is all to be co-designed, so the graphic here is just an example that's come from proposals. So yeah, it might look very different in the end. Finally, I will run interviews with flood mapping practitioners and flood management decision makers here in BC and at the federal level to investigate the barriers preventing redesign of flood mapping approaches in Canada, and also the willingness to adjust these practices to better serve Indigenous communities who are at risk of flooding. I think it's all well and good doing this research, but I think this last step is important because you can't really make recommendations of implementing it if we don't understand why or why not it should be. Thanks to my scientific background, my GIS and some hydrology, alongside my social research experience, I'm really hoping that in these partnerships and with the help of my committee, I'll be able to achieve these objectives. Hopefully the outputs of this research will specifically provide resources to Sumas First Nation to assist in their battle for greater governance over their water systems and also their ongoing battle to reduce flood risk. And if the co-design method is successful, I really hope that flood management decision makers will consider this research in their work, obviously with really culturally careful adaptations across Canada. I hope to pass on a simple one-page report to Natural Resources Canada, who are the agency that make flood mapping recommendations for the country. And finally, I'm from a country with its own suite of flood management issues, and I really hope that the work that comes out of my PhD research is of a quality that I'm proud of to take back home and make a difference there as well. So, in conclusion, there is no such thing as a natural disaster. Floods are essential processes and we need to consider how we can better live alongside them. Flood management, when undertaken poorly, can disproportionately impact Indigenous communities, and the life-saving importance of disaster prevention should not be used as a scapegoat to avoid allowing Indigenous communities governance over their own water systems. And finally, flood mapping is essential and deeply flawed, and we need to think of new ways that it can be improved, while also thinking about the deeper impact that they can have. There's a reason almost every major city in the world is built alongside rivers. Rivers are life-giving, and if we can learn to respect them and better manage our risks, then hopefully we can reduce the damage that's currently seen worldwide from flooding. That's my talk.